Ladies and gentlemen, April 21st, 2022, I am Matt Bilinsky, and this is your weekly dose of sanity, the prevailing narrative. Rapturous joy across the land this weekend in America, particularly for travelers, as the federal mask mandate was struck down by a federal judge in Florida, and no longer the CDC's requirement that everyone has to wear a mask on airplanes, trains, buses, and other public transportation has been put on ice, at least for the moment. I mean, we'll get to the legalities of it, and then we'll get to the sensibilities of it in just a minute or two. But man, I mean, just think about how much tension the flight experience has included over the past couple years. I mean, if you're a flight attendant or someone who works for an airline, I mean, think about the pure volume of tense and hostile interactions that people have had with, trying to obey by these very loose rules in terms of trying to require that people wear masks in settings where you're also allowed to eat and drink, where you kind of have to stay in one controlled setting for hours at a time. Salute to all flight attendants and people who work for airlines, because having to go enforce this, be the tip of the spear, essentially, they've been the foot soldiers of the CDC having to enforce this mask mandate, whether it makes sense or whether they like it or not. And salute to them, and I'm glad that they can get back to some sort of normal semblance of life and not have to just be fighting with passengers all day long. I mean, think about it. Someone could compile the freakouts and the flip outs of passengers and just in fights and hostilities over the past 2 years. Man, it will not be society's finest moment, but it seems to be over for the moment, even though it looks like the Biden administration is going to appeal it. So what happened here? Let's look at this from a legal perspective for a moment. A lot of attention has been directed towards the judge who struck down the mandate. She's a unique case. She was a Trump appointee, was appointed after the election, is one of the youngest, if not the youngest, federal court judges ever. I mean, I think she's only 33 years old. It was 33 at the time she was appointed. Her name is Catherine Mizelle. Yes, she is. There's no secret of her ideological leanings. She was a clerk for Clarence Thomas. She was involved in, numerous Federalist societies throughout law school in her career. Those are all very much conservative, right-leaning, and very much focused on individual liberty, as opposed to, very suspicious of any government intervention whatsoever. So there's no bones about it. She's a conservative justice, and obviously that's what a lot of critics of her decision are focusing on. As to the decision itself, listen, previously legal decisions in the Supreme Court striking down Biden's OSHA federal vaccine mandate, I think that was done on very sound legal grounds. I think a lot, OSHA was never granted the authority necessary to issue a vaccine mandate, particularly in the limited circumstances. I mean, just the concept that I've harped on at the time was that any sort of restriction or impairment of individual liberty need to be narrowly tailored, and this was just something that was done, with a sledgehammer as opposed to pinpoint. And I think the decision to strike that down was on very sound legal grounds. Admittedly, while I'm supportive of this decision and was against the federal mask mandate, admittedly, I don't think this one was done on as solid legal ground as the opposition to the vaccine mandate. This was all done under the auspices of the Public Health Services Act of 1944, pursuant to which Congress granted the CDC certain authority to address the spread of communicable diseases or other infirmaries via those traveling from outside the United States into the United States and within the United States. So the language of the Public Health Services Act itself, the Surgeon General, with the approval of the Secretary, meaning the Secretary of Health and Human Services, is authorized to make and enforce such regulations as in his judgment are necessary to prevent the introduction, transmission, or spread of communicable diseases from foreign countries into the states or possessions, or from one state or possession into another state or possession. For purposes of carrying out and enforcing such regulations, the Surgeon General may provide for such inspection, fumigation, disinfection, sanitation, pest extermination, destruction of animals or articles found to be so infected or contaminated as to be the sources of dangerous infection to human beings, and other measures as his judgment may be necessary. So I got to be honest, that's pretty broad, right? I mean, whether or not you agree with the authority that Congress granted the CDC there, Congress is elected. They are the legislatures that is the lawmaking body. They are elected officials, and they're allowed to grant an administrative body that level of authority. The question is whether or not the CDC was acting within its authority. Judge Mizell's opinion suggests that they were not, and I think it harps a lot in kind of I don't want to say a misinterpretation of the text, but a really aggressively narrow interpretation, particularly as pertains to that litany of descriptions in terms of inspection, fumigation, disinfection, and sanitation, in saying that wearing masks or in the imposition of a mask mandate on federal air travel does not fall within any of those prongs of inspection, fumigation, disinfection, or sanitation. I think that's kind of specious, right? I mean, that's a really limited interpretation, particularly of the term sanitation, and that you would essentially be limiting the CDC to just things having to do with cleaning as opposed to preventative measures like mask wearing. So once again, while I don't agree with, we'll get to it in a second, the mask mandate on airplanes when the masks are not required essentially anywhere else in the world right now, or particularly in the United States, is just nonsensical from a practical perspective. But from a legal perspective, it would seem that it falls within the kind of broad authority granted by Congress to the CDC. Kind of hard to say that imposition of a mask mandate to prevent the spread of a communicable disease does not qualify as fumigation, disinfection, sanitation, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then beyond that, Mizell, she kind of got into kind of a little, in her opinion, a little editorial about personal freedom and individual liberty. And listen, while that's all great, and in many cases, maintaining individual freedom and liberty are, legally sound principles. In this case, I mean, the question is, listen, that's the authority. The CDC had the authority that I just described. So, okay, that accepts that the CDC is in some certain cases going to be contracting individual freedom, and the question is whether or not requiring masks to be worn falls within that definition that I read earlier. It probably does, but regardless, that was the legal ruling. So what was the response to that? And I think also this is also very telling of, do the businesses that were required to enforce the mask mandate realize that it's bullshit, and also understand that it's not something that either its employees or its customers want to abide by? And I think it's pretty proof positive. In direct response, United, Delta, Southwest American, which are the four biggest air carriers in the United States, they all did away with any mask requirement, as did JetBlue, Alaska, Spirit, and Frontier. Few other airlines have followed course since then over the last couple days. The airlines know that this is unnecessary, okay? When you're not required to wear a mask in any other aspect of society, but in this one controlled situation scenario, you're required to. I mean, it just seems like the federal government found the one aspect of American life that they're in complete control over, that is a kind of indoor controlled environment, and said, okay, this one gives us plausible deniability. We'll just maintain this one mask requirement here. In a lot of other states that didn't have mask mandates through late 2021 and early 2022. I mean, even more ridiculous, but even the bluest of blue states, New York and Los Angeles, that had mask requirements more generally for indoor activities through early 2022, even those have been lifted as of the last 6 weeks. So everyone's walking around essentially without a mask, or 95% of people are not wearing masks in any sort of circumstances whatsoever. But then when you go to an airport and get on a plane, then everybody has to wear a mask. Okay, in terms of stopping the spread of a disease and of a virus, I mean, if everybody's walking around without a mask in every other scenario, period, you can pretty much gauge whether or not the virus is going to spread generally and what the prevalence of the virus is, beyond whether or not the marginal difference in preventing spread by wearing masks 85% of the time on an airplane, because you're still allowed to eat and drink and lift the mask up to eat and drink. What marginal overall benefit does anyone think that is providing in stopping the spread of COVID at this point, right? If it's spreading freely everywhere else, but you're stopping it in that limited circumstance, and you're not even necessarily stopping it because most people are wearing poorly fitted cloth masks and are lifting it up to eat and drink or go to the bathroom. Can you fathom how little actual impact that mask mandate is having, period? It's not doing a goddamn thing, okay? So beyond that, where does this not make sense? There was one individual who's a doctor on Twitter named Eric Wadera. It's like he mentions that he feels safe wearing an N95 to see COVID patients in the hospital over the course of 2 years, right? So he understands the COVID patients are not always wearing masks, but as a doctor, he's wearing an N95 to prevent himself from getting COVID or from spreading it to others. But then the response to that is people thinking, well, there's no possible way that one can protect oneself on a plane anymore without universal cloth-based masking that allows for the exception when eating and drinking. Okay, so what's he describing? The absurdity that anyone who wants to wear an N95 for the entirety of a flight and not eat or drink on the flight, go ahead and do it, okay? By all means, if you're that concerned about getting COVID, have at it, okay? If Dr. Eric Wadera can feel comfortable being safe by wearing an N95 in hospitals around COVID patients for 2 years, you'll probably be fine on an airplane where very likely nobody has COVID, and in worst case, a couple people do, right? And you're recirculating air the entire time. So the fact that there's, the notion that there's in aggregate any marginal benefit when most people are wearing poorly fitted cloth masks, everybody's eating or drinking. I mean, that's complete BS, right? Anyone who has particular concerns can wear the mask themselves. The overall impact of all these other people, most of whom are wearing cloth masks and who are eating and drinking, and that's complete theater. It's complete pageantry. It's second only to the requirement that you have to put on a mask to enter a restaurant and then you can take it off when you go sit down. We all know that the mask requirement for 6 seconds while you're getting up and going to the bathroom or leaving the restaurant does not have any marginal benefit whatsoever. So once again, anyone who is that concerned, an N95 mask worn for, almost the entirety of a 2, 3, 4 hour flight, yeah, that's probably going to provide some protection. Not that most people will need it anyways, but go ahead and do it, okay? Requiring everybody else to wear some mask when there's no requirement as to which type of mask to wear is complete nonsense. It has no practical benefit whatsoever. Aside from that, the mask mandate was going to expire a couple weeks ago. Biden extended it into early May, supposedly under the claim that they needed to assess the severity of this new subvariant of Omicron, BA2. Well, they've had time to assess that. And BA2, not that Omicron was really spreading or affecting anything anyways, there hasn't been a bump anywhere, okay? There was the most minuscule, like 10% bump in New York, and we are already coming from such a low basis. I mean, you go and look, like COVID prevalence and cases in the hospital and the ICU are at its lowest point since essentially February 2020. I mean, this is non-existent. So going from essentially non-existent to slightly above non-existent, like spare me, okay, that was some significant bump that needed to be studied if we want to look at other jurisdictions where this subvariant seems to have hit earlier. Well, in the UK, same thing. They experienced a slight bump just above what their all-time low had been, and then it went and plateaued out, okay? So the jury is in, okay? We know about BA2. It's not another wave of COVID. Omicron, beyond that, then you factor in Omicron's lack of severity in the first place, the even lower severity of the subvariant, and this is not the type of thing that needed to be studied, okay? This is an endemic disease at this point. The numbers are incredibly low, and everybody is going about their business, living their life as they were before, not paying much attention. The only people who are paying attention to this are a handful of hall monitor scolds on Twitter and people in the Biden administration. There's no justification for this whatsoever. Beyond that, do people actually believe that mask mandate, these limited mandates only on certain types of public transportation actually do anything? Well, do they maintain them? Do other institutions and governing bodies maintain them in place when they don't have to? No, they do not. Illinois lifted its mask mandate on the state's public transportation. Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, all these other jurisdictions on their public transportation, their MTAs, all lifted the mask mandate. New York, of course, goes ahead and maintains theirs. We'll see how long they maintain theirs. But the vast majority of jurisdictions the second that they weren't required to maintain the mandate via federal law, once they were given cover to get rid of them, they got rid of them, just like the airlines did, okay? Everybody knows what the general tenor and the general consensus are from businesses, from citizens, and they have, other than the handful of people who are going to keep on wearing masks, there's no desire. There's not public support for this mandate. So what's the Biden administration's response? First off, it was pretty wishy-washy. Okay, they know it doesn't have public support. They know that this makes them look continually suffocating. Like it just looks nonsensical. It's not helping them electorally. But conversely, they know that this ruling, if it's allowed to remain in place, will set a bad precedent in essentially preventing them from the CDC from taking any number of actions in the future. Right. So this does set a bad precedent for the government and government agencies if you have such a narrow interpretation of the Public Health Services Act of 1944. And there was an article in Politico today about, discussing the internal battle in the Biden administration over whether they even want to appeal this ruling. And it looks like they are going to appeal the ruling, but, there's no bones about it. There's a lot of people in the Biden administration who realize they're looking stupid, who are advocating against appealing this and saying we almost got cover, and that continuing to require people to wear masks on planes and instituting this federal mandate, it's making you look bad because it looks ridiculous, because it is ridiculous. Okay. And that this judge's, super conservative ruling almost gave Biden cover. So well, it got struck down. We can't impose the mandate any further. So we're not going to bother you. We're not going to make you jump through the hoop of continuing with this farce. But because they don't want to necessarily hamstring their public health agencies going forward for God knows what contingencies, they may appeal it. I guess it would go directly to the Supreme Court. That should be an interesting session for the Supreme Court, because once again, the conservative slant and bent of the Supreme Court got the ruling on the OSHA vaccine mandate correct. But I think, these conservative justices, I think they may understand that this district court ruling was probably a little too narrow, a narrow interpretation of the text of the legislation. So I think it's going to be more interesting. You might get some conservative justices, you might break ranks and actually try to overturn the Florida District Court's ruling here. I think that would be super interesting. But here's the most ridiculous thing about appealing this. This thing was meant to expire in early May anyways, right? By the time the Supreme Court would even hear it, right, we're going to be at a point at which it was already going to be the chances that Biden was not going to extend this any further, right? They were going to let the mandate expire in a couple weeks. This thing's not going to get heard by the Supreme Court for at least another month or two at best if it is appealed, right? So let's say they reinstitute the mandate, based purely on in legal terms. It's going to be at a time when they, from a practical perspective, don't even want to institute the mandate any longer. So Joe Biden, I think it was a mistake. It was a political mistake to extend the mask mandate any further, because it exposed it to being stricken down by a federal court judge, and now it puts them in this uncomfortable position of doing something they know is not politically popular. So continual political missteps by Joe Biden. One last point on this: the CEO of JetBlue, David Neeleman, I mean, he put it best. He's very supportive of striking down the mandate, and he acknowledges realities that it was incredibly frustrating having to police passengers continually. He knew it made his employees unhappy. It made for a worse travel experience overall. And as he put it, why can the government have the State of the Union without masks when we have to continue to mask people on airplanes? Okay, one of the many contradictions and conflicts and absurdities of continuing to require masks in the most narrow of circumstances. So Joe Biden continues to step on brakes politically. Could be looking forward to, just from a purely legal perspective, an interesting Supreme Court session on this. But for the moment, go book your flights, guys. Flash those pearly whites. Let your freak flag fly, and no more masks on airplanes for the time being. Cannot tell you how much it means to me that you've kind of joined us and have participated in this podcast during its first few episodes. Please, once again, you guys know where to find me on my socials on the internet at Matt Bilinsky, MattBilinsky. Thank you very much once again for joining us. Talk to you soon.